Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me for the first time William Engdahl. You know, William Engdahl is an award-winning geopolitical analyst, a strategic risk consultant, author, professor, and lecturer. And after earning a degree in politics from Princeton University and graduate study in comparative economics at Stockholm University, he worked as an economist and investigative freelance journalist in New York and Europe. And he is the author of a couple of books that I'm familiar with. One I've had on my shelf for a while called A Century of War, and more recently the one I want to talk to him today about, Gods of Money, Wall Street and the Death of the American Century. I would encourage those of you that are listeners, go to the Voice America website, go to my page at the Voice America website to read more about Mr. Engdahl's background. He has a very impressive background. I think what's most impressive to me is I view him as a historian who has not been bought and paid for by the ruling elite. As I said, a Princeton educated gentleman also, which is impressive because it seems to me that most of the people that come from Harvard, Princeton, and Yale end up in the clutches of people with big bucks that sort of control what they have to say. Well, from what I can see, Mr. Engdahl is an independent journalist, an independent thinker, and that's what we like most on this show, are people that aren't bought and paid for. So thank you very much for joining me today, William. It's great to have you with me. I'm really pleased and excited about talking to you in person, finally.
Well, thank you.
Really great to have you with me. In the introduction to your book, The Gods of Money, you quoted the book of Matthew in the New Testament. Specifically, you quoted Matthew 6:24, which records the words of Jesus when he said, "No one can serve two masters. He will either hate one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." And you go on to say, and I quote, "From the very beginnings of the founding of the United States as a constitutional republic in 1789, following the War of Independence against Great Britain, powerful money interests resolved that biblical conflict by anointing themselves as simply the gods of money, a higher law unto themselves, above all other mere mortals. Step by step, through the power of their money, they sought to corrupt the foundations of the Constitution, attempting to recoup the credit and financial fraud what they had lost on the field of battle back in 1776. So America kicked the King of England out of the colonies in 1776, and a government by the people, for the people, was established by some, I think, very brave men who risked their lives to take on the mighty King of England. And a long list of grievances were listed in that Declaration of Independence. It clearly noted that our rights do not come from the King of England, but from the Creator of the universe, which to Jews and Christians at least meant God. So here's the question. The final sentence in the introduction to your book, you state, and I quote, "Only when a disease is fully diagnosed and understood can it be treated. This book is an attempt to help ordinary citizens in that diagnosis," end of quote. So it seems to me, at least in part, at the heart of what you are talking about is a spiritual battle which has massive implications for the social fabric of America and indeed the Western world. Would you agree with that? Am I reading that properly?
Most definitely, even more so than when I wrote those words 6 or 7 years ago. It's a spiritual battle. I wrote in a recent article online that was published that America has lost its soul. Maybe it's too extreme a judgment, but it's very close to losing our soul. And nations have a soul just as individuals have a soul, in my view. And that soul is the combined action of a nation in the world toward other human beings, toward other nations, toward themselves. And the consequence of these endless wars that we have gone into since, well, just take the period since World War II as a starting point. And the Korean War, the Vietnam War, many
Iraq.
proxy wars, and then Iraq, and then the Iran-Iraq War, which the U.S. covertly backed on both sides in the 80s. Then the Afghan War, and now the Syrian War, and now the Ukraine war and one after the other. And it's just all of these wars. There is no one who wins in a war. No one who wins in any single war in human history. It's all a losing proposition. So you have to defend yourself if you're really a nation threatened and so forth with your life existence. Of course, you have to defend yourself. Like when a killer approaches us with a knife or a gun in a dark alley, you have to defend yourself for your life. But to be the one who instigates a war for democracy, a war for human rights, a war for who knows what in Iraq. And the problem is the American people don't even know what they're warring for.
No.
They get so hypnotized into this energy of making wars that we, think maybe there's something necessary, and it's a great tragedy.
Well, it seems to me that most people aren't thinking very much at all. We have the mass media that basically sets the table, and you have Democrats and Republicans both agreeing that we need a war for whatever reason. It makes no sense. But let's cut back to the economics, because your book is talking about the gods of money. And, in your quote from Matthew, the notion that you can't serve two masters. And certainly in the Bible, it talks so much about money. Money is really the god of so many people. I think increasingly in the Western world, it's mammon. It's the god of materialism instead of, and we have, I believe, I agree with you, that we've lost our soul. But going to the biblical concept from the Ten Commandments, certainly one of those commandments was thou shalt not steal. In other words, the idea of private property, what you earned is yours, it's your right, it's your property. It seems clear to me that what bankers are doing is stealing from the public through the use of fiat money. And of course, we went off the gold standard, went off the silver standard. Of course, the public is totally ignorant, as ignorant about money as they are about war, as you were suggesting. We're ignorant about these wars we're entering into. But do you think that this is sort of at the heart of it, the monetary system that we have, that actually enables the wars to go on as well, and allows people to think they can have something for nothing? So do you think this could be one of the basic problems, or one of the basic sins, if you want to use that word, that is destroying our soul? Is this notion of fiat money, or the notion that you can have something without working for it?
Well, the whole question of money, I think, is grossly misunderstood throughout history. But Henry Kissinger, one of the keynotes of writing the book was part of a trilogy where Kissinger in the 70s said, if you control oil, you control entire nations. Mm-hmm. If you control food, you control the people. That's the whole background to my book on genetic manipulation, the seeds of destruction. The first one is the American century Anglo-American oil politics. And then he said, if you control money, you control the entire world. And that has been, since Bretton Woods in 1944 established the dollar as the kingpin of the world monetary system, that has been the goal of these so-called gods of money. They're not gods. They're pathetic characters, but they put themselves in a position, and we worship them as gods. That's the problem. We're hypnotized by their power. A Warren Buffett, a Bill Gates, George Soros, David Rockefeller. Oh, they are so rich. They must be very intelligent, very good, very wise. And so we give them the power. We give them the power, and if we were to take that away, they would have no influence on the destiny of America. But today America is an oligarchy. There's a study done recently by a Princeton professor from my alma mater who analyzed major laws passed by the Congress since 1980, I believe, up until 2012, thereabouts. And he came to the conclusion that all of the major legislation affecting economics, income distribution, and so forth, passed by the Congress since 1980, was to the benefit of the 1%. That America is ruled by an oligarchy of an elite of enormous financial power. And it's no accident that the campaign financing laws today favor big money contributions. It's no longer a democratic process to elect a president. Hillary Clinton has billionaires lined up against the wall. Jeb Bush has billionaires against the wall. So do almost all of the other candidates. Otherwise, they don't even get into the starting gate. And that's a sad commentary on what America has become over the last 40 years.
Indeed, but we, as you point out in your book, we had a revolution, 1776, in which we were supposed to have fixed that sort of thing. I mean, this is nothing new under the sun, as it says in the book of Ecclesiastes. Human beings have been the same, but we did have a revolution in 1776 that gave, at least temporarily to a certain extent, gave the government to the people. We were a republic. We weren't ever supposed to be a democracy. Wilson got us into the First World War to save the world for democracy, or some such slogan like that, which was a lot of baloney, of course. But what happened? And do you see the same sort of moneyed interest that were involved previous to World War I and World War II are now back in control again?
Well, they never got out of control, really. The creation of the Federal Reserve in December 1913 was a coup d'etat by Wall Street, by the House of Morgan, by the House of Rockefeller, by the great international investment banks. They hijacked the Constitution of the United States. The Congress has the power to print and coin money, not a private-owned Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, most people don't realize, is privately owned by bankers, by financial interests, and not by the American people. So, of course, when the financial crisis explodes like it did in 2007, 2008, the Federal Reserve is going to act in the interest of the private money, in the interest of Goldman Sachs, of J.P. Morgan Chase, of Citigroup, and the others, the Bank of America. And we have spent trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars bailing out these corrupt criminal organizations instead of doing what the good people in Iceland did with their banking crisis when their bankers did a similar thing. After some back and forth and some debates about going with the International Monetary Fund and destroying the Iceland economy to pay for the crimes of the private bankers, the people of Iceland demanded that their government bring to trial the people responsible for the crisis, put them in jail where they're guilty of crimes, which they did, including the former prime minister, whose cronies headed up the private banks. And they were all part of a collusion. So what major banker responsible for the crisis of 2007, 2008, the biggest financial collapse in human history, has even been charged with a crime? There's a disconnect of reality here.
Oh, no question.
We Americans have lost our sense of justice, that we have a right to demand justice and to demand equity and fairness. We're hypnotized by the power of these oligarchs, these gods of money, and they're not gods. They're pathetic people. David Rockefeller, I read recently, he's 100 years old, and he's just undergone his 6th heart transplant, human heart transplant. And he's still the leader of the clan. He's still the chairman of the board of America Incorporated. And, what are we dealing with here? These are people, loveless people, who have never had in their lives, from all indications, any sense of being a worthwhile, good human being. But they take their sense of power from us. We give it to them.
we give it to them. There was a very courageous president who gave his life, I think, and I'm wondering, because reading in your book, you talked a moment ago about how Congress has the right to create money, not a private corporation. In our Constitution, it says that very clearly. And President Kennedy put that to the test, I believe. You, very interestingly, in your book, comment about Executive Order 11110, and how that was used, in fact, to give the power back to Congress. I think it was based on silver reserves that the Congress then could issue for every ounce $1 of silver. And interestingly enough, I recall I have a $5 silver certificate from back around that time. And I was putting this together. I was thinking, thanks to John Kennedy, probably I have that. That was, and you mentioned in your book that shortly before he was assassinated, the Treasury was ready to issue $10 and $20 silver certificates as well. But of course, then after Kennedy was murdered, it never happened. Talk to us a little bit about. Do you think this is the oligarchy making sure that they retain control? Do you think that is likely the reason that Kennedy was killed?
I think that's a reason. I think Vietnam was another reason. Kennedy did not want a land-ground war in Vietnam. He was very, very clear to his closest intimates. And the military-industrial complex did not want that. Wall Street did not want it. David Rockefeller wrote a very public editorial in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times at that time, opposing the Kennedy silver certificate scheme. He loathed Kennedy, from all indications. So there were many different factions. The CIA, Allen Dulles was fired by Kennedy for the Bay of Pigs fiasco done behind Kennedy's back, and also various other things. And Kennedy wanted to dismantle the CIA, tear the damn thing down. And enough of this secret government, conspiracies and cabals, and MK-Ultra, drug experiments with the human victims and so forth. So I think there's a complex of reasons that converged on Kennedy's assassination. Lyndon Johnson, part of that complex. He hated the Kennedys.
Well, we're having a little difficulty hearing you now. The connection is not very good. We're going to really want to have you back sometime, perhaps do a pre-recording with you when we get a really good connection, because you have so much to talk about. If we can hear, we got my engineers telling me a couple of minutes left, but if we can hear your answer, I think you also indicated that perhaps President Lincoln also was trying to do much the same thing at some point in time. Do you think that's the reason he had an early exit from this world?
Well, the Rothschild group out of London was directly connected to John Wilkes Booth and the Lincoln assassination. So I think that was perhaps a factor.
Very likely a connection to that as well. Well, it was certainly what you don't want to do, and I've had Ron Paul on this show, and somebody that I've known for many, many years who stood up audit the Fed and wants to get rid of the Federal Reserve, get rid of the IRS, and those institutions that you believe are unconstitutional. But
I agree.
They certainly would certainly did a job on Ron Paul. They didn't cause him to exit this world prematurely. Perhaps he didn't have enough power yet, but they made darn sure he didn't because of the way they treated him in his campaign. I think they will do it kindly if they can keep control without bloodshed, but they must keep control, it seems to me. That's the message that I get.
One thing I should add here for your listeners, they are losing control everywhere in the world over the last 3 years. The Arab Spring is not working for them. Syria is not working for them. Ukraine is a complete catastrophe for them. The sanctions against Russia are backfiring in their face. China is not working for them. They're the gods of money are naked.
Well, William, we're going to have to get you back on again. My engineer is telling me we are out of time. My apologies. Okay. I really want to have you back on, and when we get a really good, clear a good clear hearing of you, because it's unfortunate you faded in and out of us with us today. But I do want to have you back on, because you have so much valuable things to tell us. It's The Gods of Money, folks. Look it up. Buy the book. It's a must-read. William Engdahl will look forward to having you on again very soon. Thank you very much to you.